Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to the audience. We're just going to give it another minute just to get everyone in, and then we'll get started. Okay, thank you everyone for joining us tonight in Palestine, this morning in Australia, and I believe afternoon in Canada, which is where we all are, all the speakers are. This is the second webinar in the Shabaka and FMEP series, Learning and Unlearning Palestine. And today we're going to be talking about limited paradigms. So we're going to be looking at various paradigms that, in spite of their liberal facade, have actually sought to contain the Palestinian experience and limit critique on the Israeli settler colonial project. And joining me to discuss this are two brilliant scholars and colleagues, Dr. Lana Tatour, lecturer in development at the School of Social Sciences, UNSW Sydney. Lana, what does UNSW stand for?
University of New South Wales.
Okay, thank you. University of New South Wales, Sydney. Lana works on settler colonialism, indigeneity, race, citizenship, human rights, and the Middle East, with a particular focus on Palestine and the Israeli regime. And our second speaker is Dr. Muhannad Ayyash, Professor of Sociology at Mount Royal University in Canada. And Muhannad works on settler colonial sovereignty, decolonial sovereignties, political violence, and social movements with a focus on Palestine and the Israeli regime. So thank you to both of you for joining me across these massively different time zones. I'm really, really excited to have both of you on this webinar because I deeply respect your work in general, but also because I think your particular insight on this topic is critical. Now, we know that in Palestine, there has been no shortage of paradigms and frameworks thrown at us. And in some cases, as Palestinians, we've adopted them and found strengths in them. And in other cases, we've had to navigate their limitations. So I want to start with the dominant framework in which most mainstream spaces, NGOs, human rights groups, academia, etc., has adopted as a prism through which to analyze and talk about Palestine. And that is international law. Now, of course, we're not lawyers, neither are we necessarily international law specialists, but as Palestinians, we all come very well versed in international law, and we've had to be. So perhaps I can start off this conversation by asking you both, how did international law become such a prevailing framework in Palestine? Who would like to start?
Thank you. Thank you for having us, and thank you for all those who are taking the time to attend today, and thank you for organizing this wonderful event. I'm really looking forward to be in conversation with you and with the participants. I'm joining you from stolen Gadigal land, that is Sydney, and acknowledge that sovereignty was never ceded, and of course a strong commitment to land back. Speaking of international law, I think it's quite a, as you said, I don't come from a law background. Neither does Muhannad or you, but you're right in pointing that international law is such a central part of every Palestinian, right? You don't need to be an expert in international law. It governs our lives in so many different ways, and it has been governing our lives. Certainly, also looking at the ascent of Zionism, the Balfour Declaration, the investigative committees on Palestine, and the ways in which the question of Palestine have been managed through imperial period and afterwards was really through the exercise of international law. Thinking about the partition plan and the League of Nations and then the UN, we have a host of institutions that really have made decisions about our land, about our lives, without as if we don't exist. It's not just a question of consultation. It is a question of the ways in which the question of Palestine has been governed by these institutions and the different procedural mechanisms that they have implemented has completely racialized Palestinians as incapable of deciding their destiny, as inferior, as people whose faith could be decided by others. And I think this is the context in which we have been, as Palestinians, operating. First of all, seeking to make a difference, to have a voice, to have a stake in these processes. We couldn't, despite the fact that this arena has been structured against us, really playing a key role in our oppression. This is not an arena that we could have abandoned, given how important it was and remains in governing our lives. We also recognize that this is an arena that is being really shaped by, by different circumstances, political, historical, economic, and so on, and changing circumstances. And we constantly adapted the ways in which we are engaging with international law. And I think here the 60s and the 70s are really a key turning point, where we as Palestinians, Palestinian Liberation Organization, really sought recognition, but not within the framework necessarily of the liberal recognition that we know today, in seeking legitimacy and place within really an environment then that had so much hope in the UN with decolonization and anti-colonial movements, taking, really trying to change the ways in which international order is structured. And we were part of it. And there is the famous Arafat speech in the UN, and there is the famous resolution on Zionism is racism. And we managed to make really some significant achievements in this period through our allies. Today, we are in a different, and maybe I'll finish with that because I know we have, the entire webinar to talk about it. But today we are also in a different space where we recognize that international law is constantly remade and is made, and we are part of this conversation. On the one hand, we want to engage in international law, and the other hand, we don't want international law to be what is governing our struggle, what is governing, what is shaping or governing our demands. We don't want it to be, the ceiling. We want it to be another arena in which we struggle. And I think that the contestations that exist today within the Palestinian liberation movement or solidarity movement around meanings of what is apartheid or how can we understand apartheid or indigeneity and so on and so forth are part of really our attempt to shape international law and to struggle on the ways in which it gives meanings to our struggle, but also putting boundaries to the ways in which it can impose itself on us in a really, really compromising way. And also recognizing that international law is not necessarily always on the side of the oppressed. So it is an arena of also contestation with imperial and colonial and racial capitalist powers who are also engaging, and oppressive, right-wing groups who are engaging also international law, as well as engaging international law in its struggle. So it is not necessarily a tool only of the oppressed, it's an arena of contestation.
Yes, do you want me to jump in, Yara?
Yeah, go ahead.
So first of all, thank you so much for inviting me and for organizing this. Thank you to the Al Shabaka, to the Foundation for Middle East Peace. It's an absolute pleasure to be on this panel with people whose work I certainly admire, both of yours. So I'm really happy to be here. And first of all, I would also like to acknowledge that I'm speaking to you today from the homelands of the Niitsitapi, the Blackfoot Confederacy, the Siksika, Piikani, and Kainai, the Iyahe Nakoda, and the Tsuut'ina nations. And this will be a theme throughout my talk, really. These are their homelands. I don't really care much about what international law recognized as a sovereign state. That means nothing to me. These are their homelands, always have been, always will be. That's where I find meaning, that's where I find justice. And really, I have nothing to add to what Lana said. I totally agree with everything she said there in terms of how it came about that we use international law. And I want to be clear that I wholeheartedly support all legal scholars, particularly Palestinian legal scholars, anti-colonial and anti-racist legal scholars, and tremendous work in entering this arena and trying to affect change to advance the Palestinian struggle through this arena. There is some openness in this arena. And it should be approached like other arenas in which we carry out our struggle. So I wholeheartedly support that. But I also want us to have a sober assessment of what this arena, where this arena is. So let me start by just a very quick a quote from the recent United Nations Independent International Commission of Inquiry on the Occupied Palestinian Territory. So this is the commission report that then led to the the UN General Resolution to then ask the International Court of Justice to take to advise on the legal consequences of the occupation. But let me just quote from. So I mean the report is good, but let me just quote this to show us where we are. So this report in 2022 is 74 years after 1948. 74. It's 55 years after 67. The the quote unquote sort of radical conclusion of this report is, and I quote, "There are reasonable grounds to conclude that the Israeli occupation of Palestinian territory is now," I'm emphasizing the now, they don't emphasize, "is now unlawful under international law." International law is an arena that is just now starting to say there is grounds to think that what has been happening for 55 years of brutal military settler colonial occupation, of 74 years of settler colonial conquest, of over 100 years of brutal Zionist aggression and colonization of the land of Palestine, they're just now thinking it might be illegal. That's where we are in that arena. So I'm not celebrating that. I'm not celebrating that as a huge, validation of us. We've been saying these things for over 100 years. We don't need the validation of international law to know that what we're saying is the truth. Now, again, approach this arena, work within it, use it to dispel Israeli propaganda, of which there is plenty. So again, and even the commission report that I'm citing from has some good information that can be used by activists. I'm all for that. So please don't misunderstand me. But part of the language in this report as well, there's this constant talk about throughout the document, things that are happening now are quote unquote leading to permanent occupation and annexation. What leading to? It's been that since 1948. It's these sorts of little points that sometimes go unnoticed, I think, by many commentators and some activists even, that need to be highlighted so that we have again a sober assessment of what this arena entails, where we're at in it, and how much we should expect from it. So I'll end my first comments there. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you both so much for that. And Lana, something that you said really struck with me, that this is also an arena that has been structured against us, and then we kind of always assume that it's going to be on the side of the oppressed. And I think for the last 3 decades, so much energy and hope has been placed in international law by Palestinians and Palestinian civil society. And I think we're reaching a point now where Palestinians are completely disillusioned and frustrated with it, because the material gains have been so limited, and also because, you know, we're seeing, and, you know, this is down because of implementation, but we're also seeing, you know, it's also about political will of the powerful states. And we just have to look at the West's reaction to Ukraine and Russia's invasion of Ukraine. And I think, you know, for Palestinians, like, it's really, you know, when we talk about international law, we also, you know, are talking about the bare minimum. You know, we're not talking about like a ceiling, we're talking about the very bare minimum. And international law, you know, it doesn't account for the most part, it doesn't account for colonial situations. And why is that? It's because, you know, the majority of people who were behind international law and international law conventions are former colonial powers or current colonial powers. And so the provisions for colonial situations, for settler colonial situations within international law are incredibly limited, and do not give, you know, much power to colonized or indigenous people. And that's not by coincidence, that's definitely by design. But before we talk about colonialism and settler colonialism, I want us to think a little bit about, you know, what I said earlier about Palestinians sort of seeing international law as the bare minimum. You know, what does this tell us about the limitations of international law? How far can we go with international law?
It's a really good question, right? I don't think that international law has liberated any nation. It has been important tool. And again, I'm not against the use of international law, and I don't think we need to abandon that space. But liberation does not come from international law. This is not the space. And as you said, international law is constrained by international politics. And we know that international politics is skewed against us. We know the imperial and colonial and racial legacies that really shape the space of international law. And as you said, it's not coincidence that international law doesn't address, it would recognize settlements in an occupied territory, right, as illegal, but settler colonialism per se is not illegal. And that goes back to Muhannad's, the way he started his talk. Well, I don't care what international law says. This is the land of, you know, the First Nations in which I am in. I don't care if it's recognized by international law or not. And I think this is the key point. The key point is, what expectations do we have from international law? And I think also this is where the disappointment comes, right? If we have expectations that international law is going to lead to a material, real impact on the ground, then we are bound to be disappointed. But if we understand international law as a space where sometimes we can make gains, in which we can mobilize in our struggle in certain spaces, then our expectations are not, you know, as high in the ways in which we understand what are the limits of international law, but also put our own boundaries to what international law should make. So I'm thinking about, and maybe we can go into the critique of the apartheid understanding under international law later, but I'm thinking about the you know, the apartheid reports, both by human rights organizations and by the UN, and there's a difference in the ways in which they understand apartheid. Certainly recently, and under the Special Rapporteur on Palestinian Territories, Francesca Albanese. But they have been, and I see that when you appeal to liberal space in liberal spaces, they've been useful. They've been useful to a certain extent. They also have limited our struggle, but they have been useful to a certain extent. And I think this is where it gets a bit tricky. Again, it's an arena that we need to engage, But the question is, how do you mobilize some of your gains in that space? And I would say that the recognition, even if it's not in the absolute way that we want it, of Israel as an apartheid state, is an achievement. We've been saying that for decades. But also, where do we not let that define our struggle? And how do we keep pushing for reinterpretations of international law that fit our agenda, rather than work within the space that international law creates? So us also as shapers of international law.
Yeah, and again, and I agree with what Lana's saying. I'll add this. You know, to me, the main limitations of international law are twofold. There are a few, but I'll focus on two. Number one is that it does treat mostly these actions by the Israeli state or any other state committing these kinds of crimes. It views them as purely criminal problems. You know, one of the courts, the other one, not the one that I just named, the other one, the International Criminal Court. It only, as far as I know, it only treats crimes as committed by individuals, not even by states. So it doesn't actually address political context. So it doesn't address the larger questions of settler colonialism and the political structures that underpin Israeli settler colonial conquest of Palestine. So that's one major limitation. The other major limitation well, there's three, sorry. So the other major limitation is enforcement. It all depends. International law cannot be enforced except through basically the Security Council. And the Security Council is purely political, as is international law, because it can't be enforced. So even if we do get rulings in our favor, I'm not holding my breath that the Security Council will act on them, because the last thing that the Security Council does is act on principle. It does not. It acts purely in the self-interest of the American imperial hegemony. And then the third point, the third limitation of international law is that it does not speak to justice. There is an important, I may not be a legal scholar, but I do, study philosophies of law, which are just as important. I'm sorry, but legal scholars don't hold a monopoly over discussions about the law. Other scholars and everyday people affected by the law have every right to intervene in these discussions. From the perspective of philosophies of law, the law cannot ever capture justice, whether you're talking about international law or any other law, whether state, local, whatever. It cannot actually capture justice. Justice is always something that exceeds law. Law tries to claim as if it does capture justice, as if it does in its enactment, fulfill justice. And in some cases it can partially, but justice is always something that exceeds the law. And we've seen this throughout human history in all sorts of contexts where people oppose unjust law through the name of justice. The reason they're able to do that is because the law cannot capture justice. The case of Israel is ripe with such examples. And to me, justice is a much more, has a much greater potential for proper radical transformation, because that is what is needed here. You can't fix this problem by slapping Israel on the wrist. Nobody's doing that, by the way, to be clear. But even if people were, slapping them on the wrist won't resolve any of these issues. And we'll get into that in more detail once we discuss the paradigm of settler colonialism. But justice is something that is experienced in people's everyday lives, in people's suffering under these state violences that they experience on a daily basis in Palestine, on their aspirations for freedom, what they understand justice to be. That's where justice is located, not in these courts. So I follow that. I follow that as our potential for true liberation, for a true understanding of the problems that are, or of the structures of violence that brutalize Palestinian lives, and then as the path for potential decolonization of Palestine and indeed the whole region. So to me, those are all parts of the three main limitations of international law, and why we should always view it, in my opinion, as a strategic arena, as an arena where we deploy strategic moves in order to advance our cause, but we must continue basing our struggle in the lived experiences of people and their calls for justice, not the law.
if I can just add about on that for like 1 minute, I think it's really important. And I always, it takes me back to a key text that was written years ago, before the whole discussion on apartheid, etc., by Ms. Nakato and Karim Rabi' on the limitations of law, of international law. And they have warned on the ways in which international law have been really reshaping the discourse of social, the solidarity movements, and of the struggle for Palestine. And they've talked about the ways in which international law is turning the Palestinian question into an issue of rights. And I think this is really, really key intervention and key point, and goes again to that tension between liberal rights and what does it mean to understand Palestine through a liberal frame. And we've done that for so long, especially, in the 80s, liberal peace. And now we're talking about citizenship for all, which is another liberal frame, and so on and so forth. And between thinking about Palestine as a colonial question that requires decolonization.
Lana, thanks for sharing that last point. And Muhannad, the point on justice is so important, and I want us to maybe unpack that a little bit later in the discussion. But moving on just a little bit. So one of the main paradigms that the international law has given us is that of military occupation, and of course, everyone knows very well the term OPT, the Occupied Palestinian Territory, is referring to just Palestinian lands that were occupied in 1967. But activists, organizers, and many others, have long explained how the concept of military occupation is not expansive enough to describe the Palestinian experience, not least because geographically it doesn't even cover the whole territory of colonized Palestine. But the term is really wedded to our language. Even in Arabic, Palestinians still refer to al-ihtilal, to refer to the Israeli regime. So I'm just wondering, considering the increased use of the settler colonial analysis, which explains the situation in Palestine as this continuous process of colonial erasure from the Jordan River to the Mediterranean Sea, does this paradigm, does this concept of military occupation become redundant? Go for it.
Did you want to switch it up?
Muhannad, take it.
Okay, sure. We'll switch it up. So, I mean, the first thing that the limitations of military occupation, of course, it erases 48. That's the main limitation of it. It naturalizes the settler colonial conquest that took place in 1948, and it starts with 1967 as the starting point of a quote unquote solution, the two-state solution, which is a chimera and all the rest of it. Now, I do want to, so to me, military occupation, I mean, I view it as I view apartheid, as we'll discuss shortly, as a step along the continuum of settler colonial context. So the underlying structure is always settler colonial expulsion of Palestinians from their lands and the replacement with settlers, Israeli Jewish settlers. So within that, of course, it goes through many different stages and many different sort of practices and logics and institutions and whatever. And part of that is military occupation that started in 1967. Now, in terms of, to me, like, I find this a little bit tricky, the debate about what people on the ground are using. Yeah, because of course, you're absolutely right that many people in Palestine, including myself when I grew up in the 1980s and 1990s in Palestine, early 1990s, we used ihtilal all the time, right? But to me, and I'm going to speak about this more personally because I don't want to generalize about others. But to me, I never thought too much about what do these words sound like and look like, and what effects do they produce in these international law institutions or in state institutions or whatever? You use these words because everybody else was using them, but you understood with everyone else what the substance of those words were talking to. And we knew that what they were talking to was the brutalization of Palestinians, our racialization as inferior beings who do not belong to the land, as people who Israel would like to see expelled and removed from the land. Like, we understood ihtilal, for me, as all of those things. So we basically understood it as settler colonial conquest in our sort of, personal understandings and collective understandings of these issues, without knowing or paying much attention, especially I was a very young child, of knowing like, oh, there's effects of these words in legal definitions and states and all of that. But I do think that I'm not alone in this. I don't think. I do think that this happens all the time. And as well, like, we have to keep in mind that colonized populations do go through a process of constantly having collective debates about what concepts are best used to describe their experience. But often when those change, in my view, the substance does not. The substance does remain focused on how we are racialized as inferior beings, on how Israel wants to expel us and remove us. Like, I didn't need to read academic articles or read international law to know from age 8 that Israel does not want me there. It was so obvious to me that they don't want me there, or my family there, or anyone else who was Palestinian. Like, that's just so obvious. So I do want to warn against applying the way we understand these words to do have important effects. So we should have these debates in these institutions such as international law, but distinguish that a little bit from the words that are used on the streets to describe our experience, because often when we get to the definitions, we'll find that what they're talking about is very different than what that term has come to look like in a state discourse or an international institution. So.
Muhannad, that last point is so spot on, because when if you interrogate someone in Palestine on the street, or perhaps that's the wrong word to use, but when you converse with someone on the street about what they mean by ihtilal, they will explain to you this is a continuous process of erasure, and perhaps not in those terms either, but they will talk about an-nakba al-mustamirra, and the meaning and the understanding behind it is a lot deeper. And I think most Palestinians, when they use the word ihtilal, occupation in Arabic, they're not thinking of it in that sort of very limited international law framework. Lana, go ahead.
I don't have much to add. I think, that point was absolutely a key point. The gap between the ways in which Palestinians articulate and understand their reality and international law. And this is the gap that we really need to tackle, right? And we need to recognize, and we need to keep emphasizing and keep pushing, make it visible, and keep pushing international law to take seriously. And I'm saying international law, but I'm talking about human rights experts, about human rights organizations. So when I say international law, it sounds really abstract, but it has, agents made of institutions and people. So when we say that this gap exists, it doesn't exist out of the blue. It's not a natural gap. It is a gap that is being made and remade by people, by the international human rights community, who is not attentive to the local discourse or discourses in Palestine. And I think this is where we see, this is where we see also, and that's not unique to Palestinians, but we see the frustration with human rights. Not just about that it's not bringing in real material, change, but it is also about the elitist nature of human rights work that leaves the ordinary people who are experiencing settler colonialism, occupation, apartheid, segregation on a daily basis, as either treating them as databases for their reports, but not as those who need to, not as discourse producers, not as shapers of these reports, but as the material that is being used for these reports. And I think, here I think Muhannad's point is really crucial, and we need to keep holding human rights organizations accountable. The fact that they're saying apartheid is not enough. How are you engaging with people? Where do people fit in your work? Are you speaking over people, or are you speaking with people? And again, the database versus the shapers. And I think, so thank you, Muhannad, for this.
Lana, I want to stick with you a little bit, seeing as you started talking about apartheid, and we know, apartheid has gained momentum. The term apartheid has gained momentum recently in the context of Palestine, because these various human rights groups that you mentioned have started prescribing the Israeli regime as such. But it's actually been, a framework or a prism that has long been used to describe the situation in Palestine. It's got this long history in Palestinian discourse and intellectual production, which was forged by the solidarity with the Black struggle in South Africa, and the recognition of very similar structures of oppression. But since its codification in the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court in 2002, the apartheid framework has heavily relied on this rights-based discourse, which presumes the centrality of international law, and therefore, the notion that justice will be achieved with the application of said law. But as I just mentioned, apartheid, has this much longer history, and it hasn't always been understood in those terms, in those very narrow terms. And actually, Lana, you and I did a podcast on this quite some time ago for Shabaka on this liberal usage of apartheid, as you described it. So I was wondering if perhaps you could start us off by talking us through that critique of how apartheid has been watered down in a sense.
Thank you. I think that when it comes to apartheid, and many others have made this critique as well. When I wrote about it first, it was when B'Tselem, the Israeli human rights organization, released its report that Israel, came to the realization that Israel is an apartheid state, following a very long time in which it was attacking Palestinian organizations in private meetings and publicly, delegitimizing as radical for their approach, but without taking any accountability as to their role in suppressing that discourse for a really long time. Side note, that was me venting. But I think when this report came out, and it was for people who are, versed in the international human rights community, we knew that more reports are coming out on Israeli apartheid by international human rights organizations. And this report was the first report, but the reports shared very clear understanding of apartheid under international law, which is a system of racial discrimination, divorced of colonial domination and settler colonialism. So it was a very liberal reading of apartheid that really focused on the ways in which Israel has created different systems of rule and differentiated regimes of rights for Israelis and Palestinians. But as if this creation has come out of nowhere, that it has no ideological basis, that there is no overarching project behind apartheid, which is settler colonialism and Zionism. And I think probably Muhannad will speak more about settler colonialism, but what I want to say is, looking at all the critiques that were made since the B'Tselem report. It is remarkable how much power we have had as Palestinian solidarity movement, as a Palestinian movement, as Palestinian activists, Palestinian scholars, in really intervening in that discourse and putting a very forceful objection to the liberal framing of apartheid as a liberal question. And we see this impact in the recent reports that have been published by the Special Rapporteur on Palestine, Francesca Albanese, and her talks and her statements, which link directly apartheid as to settler colonialism, and seeing settler colonialism as the overarching framework in which apartheid is taking place. I would add also occupation is taking place. So, you know, this critique had influence. We had an influence of the ways in which some of this discourse is starting to change within institutions, where now I think our next forefront needs to be is about Zionism. Settler colonialism is good, but the question is, how do you read settler colonialism? If you read settler colonialism without a critique of Zionism as a colonial and racial movement, then we have gone only so far. We don't want liberal reading of settler colonialism. We want, we want to tackle the core, and that's the Zionist project. I want to see the organizations push for a recognition of Zionism as racism. I want them to really see in international law, taking in by international organizations and so on and so forth, taking the apartheid discourse to the next stage and linking it to Zionism. Because as long as Zionism remains a legitimate project, settler colonialism remains a legitimate project. There is no way around it. You don't have Zionism without settler colonialism. I know that Peter Beinart is trying. It's impossible. It is impossible. So I'd like us to now start pushing towards that direction. Again, building on our intellectual legacy, and this is also work that Noura Arikat has been doing. She's done fabulous work on, recovering some of the work that Palestinians have done around the around the resolution racism is, Zionism is racism, and talking about this. So we have an impact, and I think we can now start pushing the discourse a bit further on this.
Yeah, and I just one of the things that I absolutely loved about what Lana said is that we don't just concede these concepts to their liberal, the liberal version of them, right? Like we don't just say, well, they've ruined apartheid, they've ruined settler colonialism, I can't use it anymore. Don't do that. I don't like that approach. Like, let's continue to claim those for what they, establish the meaning of those things for what they actually are, not the liberal diluted version of them, which is always comes in to basically maintain the status quo. And also building on what Lana is saying, we see this all the time. Palestinian scholars and activists and communities articulate the context properly and accurately. It gets ignored. And then 30, 40, 50 years later, they'll come to the conclusion that we've already said that many years ago. And then they'll say, oh, look at how great, for example, look how great these Israeli revisionist historians who have finally shown the mythology of Israel's founding. Yeah, meanwhile, Palestinian scholars and activists have exposed all of that many years before. But obviously we exist within a racialized epistemological order of things where we're always going to be mistrusted or seen as prone to exaggeration or being unscientific and all the rest of all of that racist discourse that is part and parcel of Zionism and colonial modernity. So yeah, continue to listen to Palestinian voices because they're the ones that are bringing you closest to reality. Not because they're culturally Palestinian or nationally Palestinian, but because they are the ones experiencing these structures of violence and understand them in intimate ways that no one else does. So that's a really critical point. And in terms of how I theorize or conceptualize apartheid, many other scholars have done this, like Mahmoud Mamdani and many others, that have situated apartheid within the larger structure of settler colonialism, have convincingly showed how apartheid sort of appears, I call it in a recent journal article, a kind of a holding pattern, where the settler colonial conquest kind of cannot explicitly on a mass scale expel the indigenous Palestinians, and therefore apartheid comes in to kind of cement and naturalize the settler colonial conquest through mass expulsion that already happened, and sort of engage in more slow forms of annexation and expulsion, setting the stage for a future event of mass expulsion. Because on the road that we're on and following Zionist ideology, they've been telling us this implicitly and sometimes explicitly, that they do want us gone, that they do want the entire land to be majority Israeli Jews, with Palestinians making up something like 15 to 20%, no more. And so I view apartheid as a kind of a holding pattern within that larger structure of settler colonial expulsion. And without getting into the sort of nitty-gritty details of settler colonialism and what makes settler colonialism, it is in its basic form a structure of expulsion, a structure of the violence of expulsion. It continuously must expel the native indigenous Palestinians in order to create Israeli Jews, as I would call masters and lords of the land. And that's a critical part of Zionism. Zionism is not an ideology that can be redeemed. It is irredeemable. Dezionization is the only path forward for decolonization. Again, we're not the only ones saying this. Many critical anti-colonial scholars have said the same thing as well, non-Palestinians. Zionism can only be a project that operates on raciologies and racial thinking that are part and parcel of colonial modernity, that situate Israeli Jews as the superior race to the inferior Palestinians, and cannot but produce what I would call masters and lords of the land. You can't redeem a relationship with a person that starts the relationship by saying, I am your master and lord. There's no dialogue, there's no conciliation that can happen with this. Fanon saw this many decades ago. Other indigenous activists and theorists have saw this many decades ago. And I would warn here as well on the sort of discourse that paints the problem of Israel as if it's a problem of just ethno-nationalism. Israel is now an issue because it's now like Hungary, and we just turn to civic nationalism and that'll resolve everything. But the problem with that approach is that settler colonialism is not resolved through civic nationalism. We have cases of settler colonialism where we can look at how that doesn't work. Indigenous scholars and activists have said that civic nationalism in a place like Canada did not at all advance decolonization. In fact, it just became another tool by which indigenous communities were robbed of their sovereign claims. And that's the critical part of also settler colonialism. It is always the erasure and elimination, not just of individual or individual and collective bodies, but also the elimination of indigenous sovereignty. And I don't understand sovereignty here in the strict Euro-American sense. I understand it as a sort of a concept that denotes this very complex relationship that people form between land and people, which appears in many different forms. The Euro-American version of it being the sort of most destructive as far as I'm concerned, and not the one that should limit our understanding of sovereignty. So in addition to human rights as well, and going back to the limits of this discourse on civic nationalism, which is based on the notion of human rights, we're not asking just for human rights. We've been asking for decades for political sovereign rights, because that's what we are. And that's not in a zero-sum game. Our political sovereign rights do not mean the displacement of Israeli Jewish sovereign existence on the land. It just means a different form of sovereignty that needs to be radically rethought and restructured.
Thanks, Muhannad. And one of the key points that you both mentioned that I want to highlight is that using the term apartheid is not about equality. That's a liberal reading apartheid, which sort of boils down the issue to this, one person, one vote. If everyone had the vote tomorrow, it would certainly not end Zionist settler colonialism. And we can look at the case of South Africa as an example. They ended political apartheid, but economic apartheid still very much exists, and the lands and the wealth of the country still sits in the hands of a very small minority of settlers in South Africa. And so, a more radical understanding of ending apartheid or establishing an anti-apartheid movement has to be at its core, about decolonization. And there are many different pillars to decolonization, and this is an ongoing discussion among indigenous peoples and among Palestinians of what decolonization means and what it looks like. But we already mentioned, some of those core pillars. Muhannad, you mentioned, de-Zionization as a core pillar of decolonization, and justice, of course, and importantly, the repatriation of indigenous life and land, and that sort of tends to be overlooked, especially in this day and age when the word decolonization is thrown about in liberal circles as this metaphor. As indigenous scholars have described it, rather than a very real and material process. I'm going to turn to some of the questions now, even though I would love to keep chatting, because this is it's so great to be in conversation with both of you. But there are quite a few questions that perhaps, I think some of them we've already answered, but perhaps we can make our way through some of them. Although some of them are very legal, so perhaps I'm wondering we might skip past this one. So there's one question here about something which we just mentioned about this sort of citizenship for all approach, and it being described as liberal, and a decolonization approach, which would be something else. Would successful decolonization lead to an illiberal outcome, something other than a one person, one vote democracy?
I think maybe if Muhannad can take because I think what he was talking about towards the end really links to this, and then I can, if he can expand on that, because it was really interesting, and then I can jump in.
Sure. So relating to the sort of what I was talking about at the end in terms of the move to civic nationalism not being a solution, right? So there's two things that I'll start with that. First of all, Israel is not turning into one vote, one person. they're never going to do it because that would be they would de-Zionize. That would be beginning on the road to de-Zionization. They would just never do it. And settler colonial states only turn to civic nationalism once they are pretty much comfortable in their settler colonial conquest of the land. So in a place like Canada, the turn to civic nationalism and the idea of extending citizenship to indigenous communities and all of that would have never been on the books in the initial project of removing the indigenous people. It's only when they were basically eliminated and expelled to come to constitute a very small percentage of the population, of their overall demographics, that is proffered. And it's not proffered to give them freedom and liberation and all of it and decolonization. It's done to push them towards forced assimilation, to continue to basically get rid of the Indian problem, quote unquote, which was always the point of a settler colonial project. So to me, Israel will not actually ever do this. But even if it does, in some sort or another, at this state of demographics, let's say, there would be, I'm sure, without de-Zionization, there would be, I'm sure, 1,000 legal maneuvers that they would use to ensure the dominance of Israeli Jews in this context, and their dominance over the structures of governance and political and economic structures and so on. So there is no, it's not on the corner. It won't happen because it would go against what Israel is designed to do. And B, if it happens without de-Zionization, then it would just be a continuation of settler colonial domination. And so to me, I never understood, like, I don't think that Lana or anyone is saying a decolonized democracy would not be one man, one person, one vote, sorry, one person, one vote. It could be that, but that's not the definition of democracy, one person, one vote. That's not enough. And that's not, it's certainly not enough for decolonization. It involves much more radical transformation of our systems, state structures.
Thank you for this. I just want to add, I see there's a comment. Thanks for asking my question. I do hope one of the speakers will attempt to identify either a case of successful decolonization or what it might look like in this case. That really is an analytical frontier here. Every time we talk about, every time the question of decolonization is raised, this question comes to the fore. There is this kind of a quest to give a clear answer to what decolonization is or what it could mean. And in many ways, the problem with this question, I think it's an important question. I think we need to talk about what decolonization is. But whether I can give now a clear outline of, all the strands of decolonization in this kind of prescriptive way assumes that decolonization is not an ongoing process, that it's a process, that it is an event that could be perfected. It is not. It is a process. It's a political project. It is a quest. So its meaning are constantly changing through social movement demands and so on and so forth. But I will highlight a few fronts, right? So in that case, I think that identify a case of successful decolonization, I find it a bit a problematic empirical question. But speaking about South Africa, for example, which for Palestinians is really a key case, there have been a particular form of decolonization through civic nationalism, and we saw the limits of that project. We saw that the legacies of racial capitalism and settler colonialism really shaping the inequalities that exist in South Africa today. And this is a risk that Palestinians could run. And Andy Clarno wrote a fantastic book on that. Lubna Kotami also intervened in that space. And Palestinians are recognizing that more and more. I think the question is, how do we dismantle structures of colonialism? How do we dismantle legal system that is colonial? What do we do with economic system? How do we engage with the issue of return? How do we not create a society governed by brutal racial capitalism in which the Israeli Jewish population continue to control the vast majority of the land in Palestine? How do we redistribute land, wealth, property? We have the questions of the question of sovereignty and borders and statehood. How do we understand them? Do we want them? We don't want them. This is all up for debate, and social movements are intervening in that discourse as well. I think the problem with the citizenship, that even if we and I agree with Muhannad on this, but even if we go down the route of one person, one vote, it's clear that without decolonization, dezionification, what we will get is some kind of a version of South Africa, and we need to learn from that experience. So, that kind of discourse of, oh, but then there will be majority, that's not enough. That is not enough. We know that numbers are only part of the equation when it comes to really building a just future. Citizenship is a small part of the conversation. The real struggle is dismantling political, economic, legal, and social structures, thinking about patriarchy, thinking about racial capitalism, thinking about all these questions in the ways in which we articulate a decolonized society. And Palestinians will not necessarily agree on that vision. We have neoliberals among us, quite few, right? Quite a lot of them. We're not inherently or essentially anti-capitalist, right? Some of us are, some of us are. So there is also a contestation among Palestinians as to, what will happen in a liberated Palestine in which, Jews and Palestinians will live. I'm sure that there is a particular class that have a completely different, class structures, completely different visions. So we don't agree. We don't have a Palestinian answer. But these are some of the questions that for radical liberationists, decolonial project to happen, this is what we are grappling with at the moment and in the future.
And Lana, I do want to jump on that and just, I think when Palestinians are asked this question, it's quite often comes with this implied sort of lack of feasibility. Well, decolonization is not feasible. It's not within the realm of possibility. And I think the follow-up question of, give me an example of successful decolonization cases compounds that. And I think even in more insidious cases, I think it's also an attempt to shut down the conversation, because if we point to Algeria, for example, where the Algerians dismantled French settler colonialism, if we point out that as an example, we're told that, we want to wipe out the settler population. Or if we point to South Africa, as you mentioned, we're told that we want to create a minority settler population. So it's almost, I think that question is deeply problematic and almost attempts to push us into a corner that we can't come out from. And I think, you hit the nail on the head. This is an ongoing process. Decolonization is not something that's going to happen as an event. It's not going to happen tomorrow. It's going to take time. And there are pillars of decolonization. And I think it is for Palestinians to identify and to decide on those pillars. And this is something that will take a long time and will not be agreed upon, and that will require a lot of hard work, and it will be a painful and uncomfortable process. Muhannad, I'm going to let you jump in here if you want to.
Yeah, no, I mean, I agree with everything that was said, and it won't be easy. But I just want to encourage people who have not thought too much about the question of decolonization to enter it. Enter. There's a rich literature out there, whether in activist groups or scholarly works. People have been asking these very difficult questions that don't have easy answers about how we bring about a decolonized world. What does it look like? What kind of strategies are useful for achieving it? This is a lively debate within decolonial circles. So for those who have, think of decolonization as some just pie in the sky type of thinking, or too unmoored from reality. It's far from it. It's actually the only one that, as far as I'm concerned, is moored in reality. It's the one that's seeing the situation as soberly as possible, and trying to think of and calling it unbearable and unlivable for the world's majority, not just for Palestinians, and trying to find ways to deal with that and address it. So there's no agreed universal answer on what decolonization looks like. It's a lively debate. There are many discussions about what it involves, but the first thing that you need to know is that you have to be ready for a whole lot of unlearning to really understand this world of decolonization, because the majority of people are, of course, their worldview, their symbolic universe, which is not just some natural thing that drops from the sky. Symbolic universes come along with all social structures, and colonial modernity has been establishing political and social, economic, and legal structures for many, many years. And that has come with a symbolic universe that limits what people can see, what they believe is possible, and what they believe is impossible. And you do have to unlearn that symbolic universe in your process of decolonization. So you do have to decolonize yourself. It's not it won't be just enough to say, I think what is happening is wrong. You're going to have to do a lot more critical self-reflection and self-critique to actually reach that goal. Reach goal of entering a decolonial path. It takes effort, it takes time, it won't be easy. And let me just be clear to avoid the stupid questions and accusations, which will come anyway. Israeli Jews actually must be and necessarily have to be part of any real decolonial project. They just can't do it as masters and lords. And they'll have to design us to properly join that path. But decolonization would be a joint effort. Like they would be a definite, it has to be that. The experience of Palestinians under these structures of violence is the guiding post. That cannot be evaded. And it's not because, again, it's not because we're nationally or culturally Palestinian, it's because we're the ones that experience the brutality of those structures of violence, understand them in ways that Israeli Jews don't, even the progressive ones, and understand our aspirations for what a liberated, decolonized life looks like a lot better. But we can't actually get there and build that decolonized world alone. Israeli Jews would have to join that path.
Thank you, Muhannad. We'll just do two more quick questions before we bring this discussion to a close. There's a really quick one here that I feel like we can answer. Can you say something about the relation between decolonization and Palestinian refugees' right to return? Who wants to take that very quickly?
There is no decolonization without return. I mean, that's obvious. But I do think that, you know, return is going to be a very complex project. We're talking about population that have lost everything. We're talking about population that in its majority is living in poverty, that have lost its land, its property, its houses, its communities, have built alternative communities. And it's not all these aspects. And again, the redistribution here is a key, but not only redistribution, but thinking about all these kind of social aspects as well, economic, social, and political aspects. And refugees need to shape their return. They know their needs. They know how they want their, you know, they have particular visions or can make their particular visions. One thing that I would say is there have been several projects on return. And it's an interesting, because it's like, how will the villages look like, right? And then they bring architects and planners. And interestingly, especially when, you know, Israelis were part of this project, you know, Zukhrot and Palestinians, 48ers, citizens. Funny enough, a lot of, you know, the visual ways in which towns would looked like settlements. And so there is a particular colonization of our imagination as well. And we really need to be careful again, because who is charting these visions of return and who is being excluded from these visions, because otherwise we'll, you know, end up with a Palestine looking like settlements. But no, that's a, you know, in a joke, but it's really important again to talk about agency and who is in control of that process and who decides what is important and which considerations need to be put forefront. I'm certainly not that person. So it's very difficult for me to answer this question. I'm not a refugee. So it's difficult for me to weigh in substantive way.
I just want to, I agree with everything Lana said. I just want to also very quickly add, because you hear this last, oh, well, it's too complex. They've been, people have this kind of like evasive disposition towards the refugee problem, and they'll use the complexity, and they've been going but there's Palestinian scholars and activists that have gone and spent many months and years with refugees. They know what they want. They know, people can, we have come up with, political systems have come up with solutions to even bigger problems than this one. It's not an impossible one to resolve. So yes, I don't take those as if they're in good faith when people say it's too complex or it's too big of a problem or any of that sort. Yeah.
And I think that's really been a crucial theme of this discussion, pushing beyond the realms of the supposed feasibility and possibility, because these are notions that have been enforced upon us. We've been told for so many decades what is possible and what is feasible, and they've placed us in this very limited box. And when we sort of smash those notions, there's really no limit to what we can imagine and how we can envision our liberation. I'm gonna call time because we've been going now for 1 hour and 15 minutes, and this discussion has been so great. So I want to end it on that note. And I just want to extend my thanks again to Muhannad and Lana for joining me in this second episode of our series, Shabaka series, with FMEP on learning and unlearning Palestine. The recording will be available after we end this session, and I hope that all of you will join us for the next 2 sessions that we have planned. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for having us, and for all the people who took the time to come. Thank you.
Likewise.
Thanks, everyone.